Unfortunately, I think that most of Ukrainians don't distinguish Hungarian government and Hungarian people, because what we usually see and hear is mainly statements made by Orbán and his government. I cannot imagine how Ukrainians in these conditions can know that there is a big part of Hungarians who don't support Orbán.
Köszöntöm a hallgatókat, sziasztok! Ezen a héten egy angol nyelvű beszélgetést is hoztunk, ugyanis nagyon különleges vendégek érkeznek a HVG stúdiójába hamarosan. Itt lesz velünk két ukrán újságíró, Olena Removszka, az ukrán köztévé bemondója, valamint Szerhij Sztukanov, az ukrán rádió politikai műsorvezetője, akiket arról fogunk kérdezni, hogyan válik valaki háborús újságíróvá, tudnak-e különbséget tenni az ukránok Magyarország és a magyar kormány között, hogyan lehet elkerülni a háborús apátiát Európában, és milyen szerepe van az ukrán médiának a 21. század legnagyobb katonai konfliktusában. Ebben segít majd nekem kollégám, Serdült Viktória, üdvözöllek!
Szia Iván, köszöntöm a hallgatókat!
Én Nagy Iván László vagyok, ez pedig a Fülke, a HVG közötti podcastja. Olena, Szerhij, thank you so much for coming on the show. For Ricky and I, for us journalists, it's really a pleasure. It's a very exciting prospect to talk to colleagues who are reporting from times of war. And let's just stick to this topic at the beginning. Can you summarize how your life has changed as journalists, both career-wise, both personally, once the full invasion began in Ukraine?
Thank you very much for invitation. I will start by saying that if we speak about professional way, then of course our life as journalists in Ukraine changed pretty much in 2014. So I mean, that was the moment when our whole journalistic career started evolving around war in this or that way. But of course, this new phase of war, which started last year, changed pretty much everything. I mean, mainly, probably these are issues of safety and security, because before 2022, journalists knew that there is a combat zone and then they can come back to Kyiv, Lviv or Odessa and they will be safe. And now there is no more safe place and you can be under missile strike in Kyiv as well. And also probably the very big difference is that now you are worried pretty much about all the loved ones, because the whole Ukraine is a war zone. So it's not only your security issue, but also the security of your families who are in different parts of Ukraine.
I also thank for invitation to this studio. I am very pleased to be here and to speak to Hungarian listeners. It's a very big honor for us, for Ukrainian journalists. If to answer your question, I think that my work also changed a lot after the full-scale Russian invasion, because before the Russian invasion, I had a Sunday political show. So I just led one program per week. And after Russian invasion, our work, all of my colleagues, as well as me, it changed because now we are working in a framework of so-called National Marathon United News. The biggest channels, TV channels, are united in this marathon, and they broadcast their common program, their common agenda, and Ukrainian radio are also involved in this process. So firstly, we were divided into some shifts, and with colleagues we were working on these shifts during the 6 or even 12 hours, if we are saying about the night. So we relocated to the western part of Ukraine because Kyiv was under the threat of Russian occupation. So during the 3 months we worked from the regional radio station from the western part of Ukraine. It's one of the city in the western part of Ukraine. Actually, we had even the scenario to relocate abroad if there is a very big scenario of Russian invasion. So we worked with this big shift, and we covered all the topics which were linked to the war. invasion and policy and social problems and the problems of issues of IDP, internal displaced persons, and how to evacuate people. And we were trying to aware citizens about some threats, about air alerts, and so on. Also, we were trying to explain what is going on, and we were trying to somehow calm our people which faced a very big disaster in their lives.
You were talking about this 6-hour news marathon, and that was something that was really interesting me as a journalist when I visited Kiev a few months ago. Is it still running? And also, how hard was it for different TV channels and radio stations to work together?
Yes, it is still running. And I would say that the longer it exists, the more discussions are if it is still necessary. Because it was very much obvious that this is something really good, a very good idea at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It was a united source of information and everything people wanted. They wanted the official position on all the main problems and tragedies that are happening. It's a good question. It was difficult as far as I remember because none of TV channels who participate in the marathon never had any kind of experience like that. But anyway, so it appeared that they have pretty good coordination now. It's a question if they still want to participate in such a format or they would really like to have their separate programs. It would be better if we ask, different channels. But what I think is we need to consider is probably that in the conditions of the full-scale war and martial law, it would probably be quite difficult for them to earn money through the advertisement because everything just changed very much. So I don't know if all the channels have this strategy of how they could operate separately as it was before 2022 if the marathon ends.
And I want to add some words about the radio because firstly, actually, we broadcasted almost 50% of our broadcasting time. We broadcasted TV marathon. And the other half of our broadcast was our own production. But from this new season, since this September actually, we almost jumped out, if I can to say in such way, from this TV marathon. I think that only 10 or maybe 15% of our broadcast, we are still broadcasting this TV marathon, and the other time we have our own programs and products. So we are also we think that it's not very useful for the moment.
In independent media all across the world, there's this shared understanding of our role that we need to protect information, we need to inform citizens about what's happening around them, we need to be fully independent from any political pressure, and that is kind of the role we serve in the public sphere. How has this role changed in your lives when the full-scale invasion began? How did you redefine yourselves as journalists, and how differently do you look at what you're doing now compared to what you were doing, let's say, 2 years ago or 10 years ago?
The philosophy of journalism didn't change much. I mean, the critical conditions, they just underlined that what journalists should do in difficult conditions as well is something quite universal. So yes, you need to inform people. You need to sometimes explain or analyze something, what is going on around. I would say that what was very interesting for me to hear from people who were under occupation and who fortunately left these zones or were liberated, they said that when they were in occupation, one of the most frightening moments for them was not to know the news and not to have the connection with the outer world. So when they got this opportunity to connect their relatives or to switch on Ukrainian TV, they felt a huge relief. So this access to information, to understanding what is going on, what is the situation in different parts of the country, because the country is big, this is something that journalists do, and this is something that is very important for people in critical conditions as well.
I think that all of us, all of journalists, we realized that media and in particular radio plays a very big role in our society, because it was really pleasant to know that in some occupied area, temporarily occupied area of Ukraine, during the first weeks or during the first months of occupation, when Ukrainian TV channels were banned by Russian occupiers, sometimes they could listen to Ukrainian radio, and it was a very important source of information for them, because Russians told them that Kyiv is already occupied, Kharkiv is already occupied, Odessa is also occupied, and Ukrainian armed forces are beaten and nobody fight anymore. So it was very important to them to hear the truth from in particular Ukrainian radio. And actually, we received messages from people from there with such thoughts. So I think that the role of media, of journalists in time of a war is to fight, is to struggle with Russian disinformation, with Russian propaganda, because a lot of myths, a lot of disinformation are in our informational space, and we need to explain people what is going on, or how is the reality as itself. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is something that we definitely need to talk about. And we're going to talk about the Hungarian context later. But I was just curious to see, is Russian propaganda really tangible within Ukraine? Because we, from a fairly neutral standpoint, we might imagine that, well, in Ukraine, everyone knows that Ukraine is being invaded and is fighting for its freedom. Do you constantly come across Russian propaganda in your media sphere? And how do you combat it within your borders? Because we know internationally, it's a lot more difficult.
Russian propaganda transformed pretty much since 2014 and the situation in general changed, because if at the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, there were still quite a lot of people in Ukraine who had a will and an opportunity to watch Russian channels. As for now, the situation is different. So we have no Russian channels, fortunately, and eventually. But Russian propaganda uses some other ways to influence Ukraine's minds. And I think that we can speak about two different formats. The one is the use of social media and different platforms to mainly anonymous channels. For example, Telegram Messenger is very popular in Ukraine, and there are a lot of different Telegram channels, and many of them, even some very, very popular, they are anonymous, so you don't know like who exactly provide this information. And sometimes there are some information with no direct link to the first source. And of course, if this is sensitive information, people start spreading it. And at some point, even authorities have to make a statement that, listen, this is not true. And you need to understand that if you don't see the source, and if this is such a sensitive information, you need to think, isn't it a Russian informational psychological operation? And other way, I think that probably try to influence somehow through the Western, or let me say in general, foreign media, because there is still a lot of platforms for some people who write columns and opinions. And this is also the way to tell some narratives that Russia would like to spread around the world, and in Ukraine as well, because of course Ukrainian journalists, they also follow what foreign media write about the war, and some of the articles are being translated, and some of this appears to be in Ukrainian discussions as well.
I think that direct Russian propaganda mostly doesn't work in Ukraine. It means that almost everybody knows that Russia is an aggressor and Ukraine is a victim in this situation. But I agree with Olena that Russia uses new forms. And actually, I think The main purpose, the main intention of Russia for nowadays is to make Ukrainians not to believe in Ukraine, not to believe in our victory in Ukrainian armed forces, and to make us be disappointed. Russia uses a very interesting tool. Some years ago, when they wanted to share information in our informational space, they used to use Russian language, like votes in internet, in social media. They wrote some messages in Russian language, but now they use Ukrainian language, and almost always it's like Russian written messages which are translated into Ukrainian by Google Translator or some other programs. So it's very interesting to find mistakes in this, and sometimes very curious mistakes in these messages. But because these messages are shared as advertisement, they are paid in Facebook. So everybody can paste these messages, and they have some information like a lot of soldiers are dead, of Ukrainian soldiers are dead, are wounded, and the counteroffensive is absolute fail. So what are you fighting for? And our enemy is not in is not in Crimea or in Donetsk, but is in Kiev, because they just sent thousands of soldiers to die in this war. So they were trying to make us not believe in our victory, and I think it can work in some extent.
You mentioned access to information. You mentioned the front lines, and we're all journalists, and our task is to get the information out. But how difficult it is at times of war to get information from the government, from the front lines, when also you have to care for the safety of your own soldiers.
Yes, I have to outline that I mainly work as a presenter, so I don't really go to the front line. But of course, we deal with military servicemen in particular. And yes, this is a big challenge. First of all, there are already some official limitations of how journalists work in the combat zone. So I cannot go into a lot of details, because maybe I cannot know the picture 100%. But I mean that as closer you come to the combat zone itself, the more important it is for you to deal with press officers. So these are special people who work within different military units. Usually these people help for journalists, because if you don't cooperate with them, then you probably cannot get to any of these units. But the situation is very different. It depends on different moments. So sometimes this is the position of the leadership or this or that unit. Sometimes this is the position of the commanders in this or that region. I mean, the level of cooperation with journalists. But yes, it is difficult. And of course, it is also quite challenging for Ukrainian journalists as well, because we are also Ukrainian citizens. So even formally and informally, there are some limitations. When I say informally, this is your own mind and maybe self-censorship, because you're always thinking if what I show is okay and if it's not harmful for Ukrainian army. But there are also some formal limitations. I think that you can imagine it easily, yes, that you don't show precise location where the unit is stationed, or you don't show where exactly this or that artillery is being located. So yes, a lot of challenges. This is definitely much more difficult than it was before 2022.
As far as I understand, all Ukrainian journalists try to keep to those limitations and protecting the army. But is it the same for foreign journalists? Do you maybe have trouble with foreign reporting?
It's just the situation sometimes is pretty much different. I mean that when the Ukrainian journalists know that there are some limitations, for example, not to show the work of air defense forces, and we all know these limitations, and then you see the photos of one of the prominent Western news agencies showing how air defense forces work during Russian missile strike on Kyiv. So, of course, you have a lot of questions. How is that possible that they show this and we cannot show this? Mainly, if we speak about some big deal like this one, this is just the recent case that was like a week ago or something. So we have the reaction from for example, the press officer of the Air Forces. So yes, he says that we will contact this news agency and explain them that this is dangerous to show this information. I would say that it's quite often when Ukrainian journalists just sees a difference in the attitude toward Ukrainian journalists and foreign journalists. The simplest example is that probably you will see a lot of interviews given by Volodimir Zelenszkij to different foreign journalists. And if we speak about the situation with Ukrainian journalists, then during this year and a half, I think there was only one in-person interview of president to Ukrainian journalist, Ukrainian TV presenter. Also, there is a question like that there are more meetings with foreign journalists than with Ukrainian journalists. As far as I remember, there is an official position by the office of the president that colleagues, you need to understand that we rely pretty much on the foreign support in fighting in this war. So, of course, we need to communicate with them. But I think that this is not an excuse of the way of how communication with Ukrainian journalists is being built. So a lot of questions, yes, but as there are discussions, fortunately, the representatives of the authorities, they usually react if journalists publicly raise the question.
What you were mentioning is very interesting, that both President Zelenszkij and both his office are doing an immense job in the Western world and in the Western media to gather support for Ukraine. But there is another issue which you have slightly touched on when we were talking about Russian propaganda, which inevitably happens when the war elongates and people fall into this kind of war apathy. And my question is, how do you think this can be tackled? How do you think you can get to those people and let them know that this is something still worth fighting for, that they cannot go for a compromise, that they need to encourage their governments to invest in Ukraine and invest in Ukraine's victory? Or to give a much more mundane example, as people have gotten apathetic about COVID, for Western audiences, the war is just like that, a kind of fading crisis. How do you keep this support alive in the West?
Okay, I think that it is very important to deliver messages to Western audience, to Western citizens, because your authorities are very dependent on the public opinion in your countries. And I think that it should be some mix of efforts provided by our officials, by our authorities. So there are maybe a few levels of this kind of work. The first, the highest level is, of course, political diplomacy. Our president is quite prominent, I think, in this issue during the last year and a half. And he is quite honorable in this meaning in European country as well as in the United States. So diplomatic level is very important to communicate with officials, with authorities in the European Union and other countries of the Western world. And the next level, I think, it's a cultural diplomacy. I mean, all the efforts provided by non-governmental organizations, cultural organizations, as well as artists who are going from country to country and speak about the Ukraine, about the nature of this war, about the intentions of Russia, and about why are we fighting. And the next level is actually journalism, because it's very important also from our side. We are responsible to maintain the level of support in your country. So I think all these participants of this process, they should deliver some messages which could make more understandable for Europeans in particular what is Russia for nowadays, that it is like dictatorship. I think very important to understand that it is not only our Ukrainian problem. It's constantly Ukrainian problem for decades or more, even for centuries, but it is a problem also for countries in eastern part of Europe, like Baltic countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, and so on. So if Ukraine is failed, they will be maybe the next. Moldova, I think it's no doubt, will be by Russian aggression. And actually, we should deliver the message that all compromises with Russia doesn't make sense, because Russian occupation means just death for people, because Russia committed war crimes, tortured people. There are a lot of prison in occupied territories. It's like Gulag, so on, yes. So we should fight till our victory, and will be our common victory. All the democratic world should support Ukraine, because it will be the victory of all democratic world.
I would say that I think that Ukrainian authorities, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they are quite successful in building this very active communication with the world. And what this strategy showed, I think, for all of us, is that you really need to be active and creative in looking for ways how you should talk to the world with such a difficult and tragical topic. So this is something that probably different spheres, in particular those which Szerhij mentioned, should consider, that you need to be active and creative. You don't really need to sit and expect that all the world will be always very interested in the war. Unfortunately, we live under such a conditions when we have a lot of information. And unfortunately, yes, when war is still there, at some point, maybe some people will get tired. It's quite strange for me to hear this, wording, tired of war, when we don't speak about Ukrainians. But anyway, this is probably something that we need to count on. And I think that what is important for foreign journalists and foreign media outlets to consider, that maybe sometimes you really need to involve Ukrainian journalists or analysts or observers to your reporting or to your coverage of Ukraine's war, because sometimes you just read a lot of opinions, columns, reports from Ukraine made by foreign journalists, but they never include Ukrainians. And that's strange as for me, because sometimes Ukrainian journalists, for example, they have better contacts or some original prospect, and that also could be useful.
Just one word. I think that apathy and tiredness can be in a case when you don't understand how this war can end. What is the end of this war? And I think in this case, also Western media should ask Ukrainian experts, because we have some vision how it should finish and how our victory should look like. So ask us, and we will try to answer you, because when this issue is understandable, it leads to apathy and tiredness.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And there's one more topic that we definitely need to discuss. And it's honestly shameful for us to admit that we live in a country and we try to work as independent journalists in a country which is governed by a party and it's governed by a prime minister who quite overtly acts as a Trojan horse for the Kremlin. And a lot of what he says and does echoes what the Kremlin wants him to say and what the Kremlin wants him to do. We clearly see that Ukrainian-Hungarian relations have suffered since the full invasion began in last February. Can Ukrainian people, the general public, or what your impression is through the media, differentiate between the Hungarian government and its media and its propaganda and the Hungarian people? In a very simple term, do Ukrainians have a problem with Hungary, or do they have a problem with the Hungarian government who tries to define themselves as the whole country?
I will disappoint you. Unfortunately, I think that most of Ukrainians don't distinguish Hungarian government and Hungarian people, because what we usually see and hear is mainly statements made by Orbán and his government. I cannot imagine how Ukrainians in these conditions can know that there is a big part of Hungarians who don't support Orbán. We have an example, for example, of Georgia, where the situation is also very interesting because they have this pro-Russian government. But what Ukrainians also saw is that there were big demonstrations in support of Ukraine in Georgia. So if you ask Ukrainian about Georgia, they will probably tell you that, yes, we know that there is a pro-Russian government, but we know that there is a big part of Georgians who support Ukraine and who don't agree with the politics of this ruling party. When we speak about Hungary, we have only Orbán's statements, and that's all. Of course, those people who unfortunately had to flee the war and found a shelter or a temporary shelter in Hungary, probably they saw the support of Hungarian people. But I don't think that this is like a very big amount of people, because that was not probably the main way for Ukrainian refugees. And of course, there are some media outlets in Ukraine who cover this EU topic and Hungary in particular, and they sometimes write about the situation in Hungary, about the Hungarian propaganda, how all this works in Hungary, or how different the situation is in Budapest and the rest of Hungary. But I would say that these articles, they are probably not the articles of the general interest.
I want to say that unfortunately, we have a very little coverage of Hungary in our country. So we are definitely see only the statements of Orbán or Szijjártó, and they repeat some Russian narratives, Russian propaganda. I think it's natural that during the war, majority of our people has black-white optic, and we divide our neighbors and other countries like our supporters and our partners and actually our enemies. Or maybe the third part is countries who are very neutral, but actually statements of Orbán and Szijjártó, they looks like supporters of Russia. I think that Ukrainians don't make difference between Hungary government and Hungary people. I think the very similar situation is with Belarus, because historically Belarusian people is very close to Ukrainians. I think before the 16th century, maybe we were very similar ethnic and cultural groups, but then we were under Poland and the Belarusians were under Lithuania, so we had our ways. But I mean that now, because Belarus is a partner of Russia, so Belarus is like an aggressor also with Russia. So Ukrainians don't like Belarusians as well. So we have a little bit discussion whether Belarusian people also responsible for the Lukashenko regime crimes and acts. But I have to say that maybe a majority thinks that Belarusian people also responsible for these crimes.
There are some signs in Hungary that this relation between Hungary and Ukraine might change. At least President Novak visited Kiev a few weeks ago or a month ago. Do you see this as a way to reconciliation, or is there something else that would be needed to have a better relationship between Hungary and Ukraine?
It's quite difficult to answer because the public rhetoric of the main person in the country, I mean, Prime Minister Orbán, don't change much. And I think it will be quite difficult for Ukrainians to change their opinion about him because he was the person, if I'm not mistaken, who questioned, for example, the genocide in Bucha, if I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. If I make a mistake, so you just cut it off. But I think
but it is correct. He didn't question it. He said there needs to be independent investigation going into it, but he kind of tackled or got around answering the question.
He did question was the sovereignty of Ukraine.
For example, so, it will be quite difficult for Ukrainians to change the perception of Orbán. I cannot even imagine what can he do to change the view of Hungary among the Ukrainians. But anyway, of course, I think if Hungarians or Hungarian journalists will be active working with Ukrainian topic and covering how all this is happening. I know that there are some humanitarian organizations from Hungary who helps Ukrainians inside Ukraine. So maybe it will influence a little bit. But on the very general level, I think that so much was already said during this year and a half, then it will be quite difficult for Ukrainians to change their mind.
I think, anyway, it is an important act of Hungary to visit Kiev, and this presidential visit is very good because I cannot imagine a meeting between Zelenszkij and Orbán nowadays, because I think they couldn't have any agenda to speak, but the presidential visit is very good. But I think that if to look into the future, I think that Ukrainian-Hungary relationship must be like good neighbors. But maybe the conditions for this situation will be after our victory, I think.
Olena, Szerhij, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Köszönjük a figyelmet hallgatóinknak, a Fülke hamarosan folytatódik, addig is iratkozzanak fel a HVG Podcastokra és kapcsolják be az értesítéseket, ugyanis elindult a Mérlegen és a Zékaszt új évadja, valamint elrajtolt a Vasfüggöny és a Köz jól is, ne maradjanak le róla. Én Nagy Iván László vagyok, viszonthallásra.